10 miles off the coast of New Hampshire, where the Piscataqua River empties into the open Atlantic, there is a scatter of small islands called the Isles of Shoals. Fishermen named one of them for the way seaweed clung to its rocks at low tide, giving it a dark, smudged look from a distance. They called it Smuttynose. In March of 1873, on a night when the temperature dropped well below freezing and the tide ran fast beneath a bright moon, a rowboat crossed those 10 miles of open water. The man inside it knew exactly where he was going, and he knew that when he arrived, 3 women would be alone. If you've enjoyed this case, please like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what's the weather like where you are right now? By morning, 2 of them were dead. This is the story of the Smuttynose murders, one of the most thoroughly documented, most fiercely argued over crimes of 19th century New England, a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence, decided by a single survivor's testimony, and still debated by historians more than 150 years later. By the early 1870s, the Isles of Shoals had built a strange dual identity. Appledore Island, just a short distance from Smuttynose, hosted a grand seasonal hotel that drew writers, painters, and wealthy vacationers from Boston and New York. But Smuttynose itself belonged to a different world entirely, a working island. 27 acres of bare rock, home to a handful of fishing families who endured the winter months in near-total isolation. Fishing was the region's lifeblood. Cod and haddock were hauled from the Gulf of Maine and sold on the mainland at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a busy port town connected to the islands by boat traffic that could be cut off for days at a time by weather. In winter, when storms rolled in off the Atlantic, the Isles of Shoals could feel less like a New England fishing community and more like the edge of the known world. It was into this hard, wind-scoured landscape that a small colony of Norwegian immigrants had settled, chasing the same promise that drew hundreds of thousands of Europeans to America in the years after the Civil War: steady work and land, and the chance to build something of their own. In 1866, a Norwegian couple named John and Maren Hontvedt left hard times at home for the United States. They tried city life in Boston first, and didn't take to it. As soon as they had saved enough money, they moved north to the coast and settled on Smuttynose Island, where John bought a fishing schooner and began building a modest but genuine livelihood. Success for John Hontvedt meant bringing family across the ocean. He sent for his brother Matthew, and Maren sent for her sister, Karen Christensen, who came to help with the household and later took seasonal work at the hotel on nearby Appledore Island. The following year, more relatives arrived: Maren and Karen's brother, Even Christensen, along with his new bride, a young woman named Anethe Matea Christensen. By the winter of 1873, the extended Hontvedt Christensen family had built a genuinely close-knit life on the island. The men fished together aboard John's schooner. The women ran the household, tending livestock, cooking, sewing, and enduring the isolation that came with a home reachable only by boat. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary immigrant success story, modest, hard-won, and utterly unremarkable, until the night everything changed. The previous year, John Hontvedt had needed another hand aboard his fishing schooner. He hired a Prussian immigrant living in Portsmouth, named Louis Wagner, offering him room and board on Smuttynose in exchange for his labour. Wagner was, by most descriptions, a large, physically capable man in his late 20s, but one who struggled to hold steady work and was frequently troubled by rheumatism. He lived with the Hontvedt family for the better part of a year, eating at their table, sleeping under their roof, and coming to know the layout of their small island home in intimate detail, where the axe was kept by the door, where the well stood, which trunk belonged to which family member. When Even Christensen and his new bride Anethe arrived from Norway that autumn, the household's arrangement with Wagner came to an end. He returned to the mainland, took a room at a boarding house in Portsmouth, and by the winter of 1873 was, by every account, broke behind on his rent, working odd jobs when he could find them, and increasingly desperate. He also knew something almost no one else did, that John Hontvedt had been quietly saving money, several $100s, by his own later estimate toward the purchase of a new boat. On the morning of March 5th, 1873, John Hontvedt, his brother Matthew, and his brother-in-law even rowed the schooner into Portsmouth to collect a shipment of bait that was due to arrive by rail from Boston. The shipment was delayed. Word was sent back to the island, by way of another boat, that the men would not be returning that night. In Portsmouth, the 3 men crossed paths with Louis Wagner and asked if he would help them bait trawls once the shipment finally came in. Wagner knew, from that conversation, two critical facts. The men would not be going home that night, and the women on Smuttynose Island, Maren, her sister Karen, and her sister-in-law Anathy would be alone. He was seen in town that evening, then he disappeared. Sometime around 8 o'clock that night, a small rowboat went missing from a wharf in Portsmouth. Whoever took it rowed roughly 10 miles across open, freezing water, helped along by a strong outgoing tide, and brought the boat ashore on the far side of Smuttynose Island, the side facing away from where the Hontvett family normally kept watch. The man who came ashore knew exactly where to go. Inside the cottage, the 3 women had settled in for the night. Karen was staying over, sleeping on a makeshift bed near the kitchen stove, while Maren and Nanetha shared the bedroom. Sometime after midnight, the family dog stirred. Karen woke to find a man's shape standing in the dark kitchen, believing for a confused moment that it was her brother-in-law John returning early. She called out his name. It was not John. The intruder attacked her with a chair. Her screams woke Maren, who came out, saw the struggle, and managed to pull her wounded sister into the bedroom and bolt the door. The man pounded against it. Maren, realizing the door would not hold, urged Anathy toward the bedroom window as their only way out. Anathy went first and froze a short distance from the house, paralyzed with fear. The intruder burst back outside, seized the household's axe from beside the door, and ran toward her. In that moment, according to Maren's later testimony, Anathy recognized him and cried out his name 3 times. Louis, Louis, Louis. Maren watched from the window as a single blow ended Anathy's life. The man turned back toward the house. Maren tried once more to get Karen through the window, but her sister was too badly hurt to move. With the door giving way behind her, Maren made the decision that would save her life. She climbed out alone, just as the intruder broke into the room and swung the axe at her. The blow missed her and struck the windowsill with such force that the axe head snapped off its handle. From outside, in the dark, Maren heard her sister's final cries. Barefoot, in her nightclothes in freezing March air, Maren Hontvett fled into the dark carrying the family's small dog, afraid that if she set it down, its barking would give away her hiding place. She considered the henhouse and rejected it as too obvious. She ran toward the dock hoping to escape by boat, only to find that the killer had landed on the opposite shore and there was no boat to take. She finally found a low outcropping of rock and waited there through the remaining hours of the night, with only the dog for warmth, not knowing whether the man who had just killed 2 members of her family was still somewhere on the island with her. At first light she made her way to a connected strip of land and called out toward the neighbouring island of Appledore, where children playing outside heard her and raised the alarm. She was brought to safety, and it was there, within hours of the attack, that Maren named her family's former boarder as the man who had done it, Louis Wagner. The account Maren gave matched what investigators found waiting for them across town, in Portsmouth. Witnesses recalled that Louis Wagner had looked haggard and unwell that morning as though he hadn't slept. He ate breakfast at his boarding house, packed a bag, and caught the 9 o'clock train to Boston, all before any word of the murders had reached the mainland. His landlady and her daughter later testified that they had locked the boarding house's back door the night before, and that another man not Wagner had slept on the downstairs sofa, where Wagner claimed to have spent the night. They also testified to seeing Wagner return that morning wet, dishevelled, and carrying a bundle out to the privy behind the house. Once Maren's account reached Portsmouth, a manhunt began almost immediately. Detectives traced Wagner to Boston, where despite having been unable to pay his rent only days earlier, he had purchased a new suit of clothes and boots, gotten a shave and a haircut, and gone straight to a North End neighbourhood where he was well known from earlier years. He was arrested there that same evening and put on a train back to Portsmouth. The scene at the depot when he arrived was not calm. A crowd carrying torches had gathered, having already heard the news, and the police wagon carrying Wagner was pelted with stones on its way to the station. Because Smuttynose Island technically falls under the jurisdiction of the state of Maine rather than New Hampshire, Wagner ultimately had to be extradited and moved, under guard, through another hostile crowd to a jail in Maine to await trial. The case against Louis Wagner was built entirely on circumstantial evidence, but that evidence formed a chain investigators and prosecutors found difficult to escape. Investigators recovered a torn, blood-stained shirt hidden in the privy of Wagner's boarding house the same bundle his landlady's daughter had seen him carrying out that morning. The landlady identified it as a shirt she had regularly laundered for him. Money mattered too. The night of the murders, roughly $15 had been taken from the Hontvett home. The following day, despite having been penniless and behind on rent, Wagner spent almost exactly that amount on new clothing and boots in Boston. Among coins found in his pocket at the time of his arrest was a small button one which Merrin testified she had given to her sister Karen from her own sewing box. Investigators also found footprints matching the size of Wagner's boots in the snow around the island, along with bloodied towels left near the property's well, a detail investigators considered significant, since the well was little more than a low ring of stones, unlikely to be found easily by anyone unfamiliar with the property. When questioned about his whereabouts that night, Wagner's account did not hold up. He claimed he had spent the evening helping bait trawls for a fishing boat he could not name, belonging to a captain he could not identify, docked at a pier whose location he could not recall. He said he had then gone to a saloon for 2 beers before falling asleep outdoors, but could not name that saloon either. No witness ever came forward to support any part of his account, leaving roughly 11 hours of his time that night entirely unaccounted for. Investigators and prosecutors argued that a genuinely innocent man, wrongly accused of a capital crime, would ordinarily be able to produce at least one witness to establish where he actually was. Wagner never did. Louis Wagner's trial opened in York County, Maine, in June of 1873 and quickly became a public sensation. Crowds packed the courtroom to capacity, and newspapers across New England as far away as Boston covered the proceedings in detail. The prosecution's case rested on the total weight of the circumstantial evidence, Wagner's intimate knowledge of the household and its money, his unexplained absence that night, his sudden and unaffordable spending the next morning, the bloodied shirt, the matching button, and above all, Merrin Honvett's direct identification of him, including her account of Anethy crying out his name in the moments before her death. The defense argued that no physical evidence placed Wagner on the island with absolute certainty, and that circumstantial evidence, however extensive, was not the same as proof. But Merrin's testimony carried enormous weight. She had named Wagner within hours of her rescue, long before any physical evidence had been gathered, and at a time when, if she had named the wrong man, her account could easily have been contradicted by anyone who had seen the real killer elsewhere that night. No one ever came forward to do so. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of premeditated murder. Wagner was sentenced to death by hanging, but under Maine law at the time, an execution could not proceed until the governor personally signed a death warrant, and Maine's governors, reflecting the state's uneasy relationship with capital punishment, were often reluctant to do so. The result was a lengthy limbo, during which Wagner remained imprisoned awaiting a warrant that for a time showed no sign of coming. Wagner used the delay to plan an escape. Reports indicate he worked at the lock on his cell, using a makeshift tool, at one point a wooden implement smuggled to him, and eventually broke free. He evaded capture for a period before being tracked down and returned to custody, this time under considerably heavier restraint. Throughout his imprisonment, Wagner continued to insist on his innocence at times, suggesting that Merrin Hontvett herself, or her husband John, had been responsible for the murders. Investigators and later historians who examined these claims found no supporting evidence for them, and noted that Wagner offered different and shifting explanations for the crime over time. Maine's legislature eventually amended the law, requiring the governor to issue a death warrant within a fixed period of sentencing. Wagner's case moved forward under the new rule. On June 25, 1875, Louis Wagner was hanged at the Maine State Prison in Thomaston, executed the same day as another condemned man, John True Gordon, convicted separately of killing members of his own family. It would prove to be one of the last executions carried out by the state of Maine before capital punishment there fell into decline and was eventually abolished. Some later local accounts place Wagner's execution in the spring of 1874. The best documented and most consistently corroborated primary sources, including Maine State Archives records, the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, and multiple period newspapers, place it on June 25, 1875. Where sources disagree on a date, that disagreement is worth naming rather than quietly resolving. Wagner maintained his innocence to the end and never confessed. The murders of Karen and Anetha Christensen left a lasting mark on the Isles of Shoals and on the wider region. Maren Hontvedt, the sole survivor and the case's central witness, eventually left the island. The events of that night followed her for the rest of her life. The case also produced one of the era's most enduring pieces of true crime writing. Celia Thaxter, a poet who had grown up on the Isles of Shoals and knew the victims personally, wrote a detailed account of the murders titled A Memorable Murder, published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1875. It remains a foundational text for anyone researching the case. More than a century later, novelist Anita Shreve revisited the story in her 1997 novel The Weight of Water, which imagined an alternate version of events in which Maren, not Wagner, was responsible for the killings, a theory rooted in an unverified rumour of a deathbed confession that circulated in 1876 newspapers and was retracted almost immediately after it appeared. The novel was adapted into a feature film in 2000. Despite the enduring fascination with alternate theories, historians who have examined the case in depth, including researcher J. Dennis Robinson, whose work draws on trial records and period documentation, have generally concluded that the evidence against Wagner remains overwhelming. Smuttynose Island itself survives today largely undeveloped. Owned in part for conservation purposes, its story kept alive through local history organisations, archival photograph collections, and a case file that continues to be studied as one of the best documented circumstantial murder trials of its century. What makes the Smuttynose case endure isn't simply its violence. 19th-century New England saw plenty of that. It's the shape of the evidence, no confession, no eyewitness testimony beyond a single traumatised survivor, and a defendant who protested his innocence until the moment the trap opened beneath him. It is a case built entirely on the patient accumulation of small, ordinary facts: a button, a shirt, a missing boat, a debt suddenly paid, each one insufficient alone and devastating together. More than a century and a half later, the Isles of Shoals remain a quiet, windswept place. But the story of one March night in 1873, and of the 3 women who found themselves alone on a small island in the dark, has never entirely faded from the historical record.